Welcome to the NCFCA Online Summit. My name is Amy Joy Tofty, and it is my pleasure to serve as the Director of Education for NCFCA. Since 2001, NCFCA has empowered Christian students to apply and communicate their worldview with skill and clarity. Through regional and national competitions supported by robust training and curriculum, tens of thousands of students have demonstrated confidence and excellence in communicating truth with grace. To meet your challenge, visit www.ncfca.org. Thank you for joining us today for our free online summit, a one-week workshop that inspires Christian students to grow their communication skills. You'll enjoy 30 minutes of live teaching, followed by a fantastic giveaway and live Q&A. And our giveaway today is a one-week full scholarship to Forge leadership training. So it's a great opportunity. You'll want to stick around for that. If you enjoy your time with us this week, we invite you to register for our NCFCA Online Intensive, August 3rd through the 7th, where you'll build upon what we learned here today with live teaching sessions and facilitated group breakout activities brought to you by the fantastic team of NCFCA leaders and alumni. The spaces are limited, so visit ncfca.org/intensive for more information. To get the most out of each session, we want you to fully focus on the speaker. So if you have questions about NCFCA or our resources or competition opportunities, join us Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoons at 4 p.m. and we'll answer all of your questions about NCFCA competition. If you need technical assistance during the session, email summittech@ncfca.org and we'll help you as quickly as possible. Now, there will be select opportunities for you to share in the chat box. So when you're asked to contribute an idea, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll keep the chat turned off so that we can all focus in on the fantastic material being presented by our speaker. If you have questions about specific material presented in this session, please submit those questions by clicking on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we'll sift through those questions and answer just as many of them as possible during our live Q&A. In the book of Colossians, chapter 4, verse 6, the Apostle Paul writes, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." One way that we can season our speeches is by adding stories that connect with our listeners. So in session 3, Engaging Your Audience, we'll discover the building blocks of good storytelling and learn how to convey information through compelling stories. Your instructor for this session is Paige Senseman. Paige is a Region 6 NCFCA alumnus who competed in 11 speech events, placing 3rd in biographical narrative at the 2018 National Championship and 1st in original oratory at the 2018 Ohio Mixer. Paige will be double majoring in worship and strategic communication at Cedarville University this fall. So Paige, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Tofty. I'm so excited to get to talk to you all today about engaging your audience through storytelling. Now, you may be wondering who I am. So other than those accolades that Mrs. Tofty just described, I want to give you kind of my background in NCFCA, how I got into speaking. And I noticed that some of you are younger, 12, 13 years old, and you actually started earlier than I did in speaking. So kudos to you for getting a head start. But I was forced into public speaking by my mom before my freshman year, 4 years ago. And I took one speech that I had written and impromptu to a practice tournament. And needless to say, it was awful. It went very, very poorly. I was so nervous. And I gave my first impromptu speech. It was a quote from Ronald Reagan was the topic that I got. I pretty much just read the topic and then said, "Thank you so much for your time," and left. And when I exited the room, I started crying and it was just the tension release. And I was crying to my mom and I said, "And my feet just hurt so bad. This is just the worst. It couldn't possibly get any worse. I'm in so much pain. I've been wearing these heels all morning." And I looked down at my feet and I realized that my shoes were on the wrong feet. So this entire morning and the 20-second impromptu speech that I gave, my shoes were on the wrong feet. So if you have no clue what you're doing, if this has been totally overwhelming so far and you're absolutely terrified of public speaking, look down at your feet right now. If you're not wearing shoes, great. If you are wearing shoes, if they're on the right feet, you already have a head start ahead of me when I started. I competed for 3 years in NCFCA in speech only, so don't ask me any debate questions. Let's just stick to speech here. So there's a little bit of an intro about me. I am very, very passionate about storytelling. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I love seeing everybody's favorite stories in the chat. You guys are better readers than I am. I typically just watch the movies, but Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Pride and Prejudice, Animal Farm, Swiss Family Robinson, Narnia, those are all phenomenal stories. And if you have a favorite movie, I know we all have a lot of favorites, but if you have a favorite movie, go ahead and drop it in the chat. I want to see what your favorite movies are. For me, I love superhero movies. The Avengers, Captain America, Wonder Woman, and I have just recently started rewatching Star Wars, and I just absolutely love all of the Star Wars movies. I'm watching them from like 1 through like 3, and then Rogue One and Solo, and then 4 through 9. So kind of the chronological order of the story. So if you have favorite movies, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Yeah, The Giver is a great movie. God's Not Dead, Stranger Things. Love it. Avengers, Greatest Showman. That's an awesome soundtrack. What a way to storytell through music. That's awesome. La La Land, again with the music. Yeah, that's awesome, you guys. Yeah, wow, they're going by so fast. Yes, tons of Disney movies. I love Disney movies. Walt Disney was a phenomenal storyteller. I think he was quite a bit ahead of his time with movies, and he really constructed the idea of storytelling through movies. And he said, this is what we storytellers do. We restore order with imagination. We instill hope again and again and again. He created this idea of making a fictionary world, drawing your audience in, and then giving them hope for a better and brighter day. For a moment, they can forget about the chaos and stress of real life, step into the world that we create for them, and then experience the hope that our characters experience. Storytelling is a key part of communication. It can be incorporated into any speech and really any communication in general. Let's set aside platform and interpretation speeches for a second. Maybe you're writing an Instagram post about your latest vacation. Maybe you're babysitting your little siblings and they really want a bedtime story that they haven't heard a million times. Maybe you're sharing something God has done in your life with someone who isn't a Christian. Mastery of storytelling is a life skill, not just a speech skill. But for now, we'll talk about it in the context of formal public speaking. An engaging presentation plays to the audience's natural love of stories and compels them to listen intently and internalize your content. It's a tool we can use to be sure that our audience is taking our message home and that it provides more impact than the content alone. So in the next 30 minutes or so, you will learn to engage your audience by analyzing the building blocks of good storytelling and conveying information through compelling stories. I hope to show you that incorporating storytelling into your speeches will not only draw your audience in, but it will bond them to your message, that they may be positively impacted by your speech. So first, I want to analyze the building blocks of good storytelling. Let's first understand why we all love good stories. It's because of the tension in history. So if we think of history as one big story, we know from the biblical worldview that good and evil wage war in our world, and we are in the middle of the story, waiting for the resolution, the ending. God created the perfect world for Adam and Eve to live in and to enjoy life with God forever. But because of their disobedience, death, sin, and suffering entered the world through mankind and infected everything there is. That's the beginning of the story. And because of that, because we haven't experienced the resolution that comes with Jesus' second coming, we experience this tension in our lives. Paul describes it in Romans 8. For the creation, nature waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, not only nature, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit through salvation in Jesus Christ, we also groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. The significant point of this is that human nature longs for good to triumph over evil. We experience this tension ourselves. So we connect with stories that resolve the tension. The goal of a good story is to draw the listener in so that they're experiencing it with the characters. So in stories that draw us in and instill hope, we love those stories. We connect with those stories because that's what we're eagerly longing for as mankind, for the redemption of our bodies, for the restoration of the world. And we also connect with the flip side. Often in our lives, we experience the groanings of creation, where evil prospers, like in the life of Job, where a good person suffers. So we connect with stories that express the unresolved tension. Even if they don't instill hope, we can relate to those stories. So the goal of our storytelling in speeches is to create this world, draw our audience in, so that they can connect with either the unresolved tension and relate to it, or to experience the resolution of tension that they long for. So how do we effectively create the world and draw them into it? Well, let's take a look at the model. 6 elements of a compelling presentation. And this is straight out of the NCFCA speech curriculum. So I encourage you to purchase that. That's a great resource to begin building your speaking skills. So I want to read the same story, but I have 2 different versions. So here's the first. The Nobel Peace Prize was created by Alfred Nobel, a man who made explosives. One day, the newspaper accidentally printed Alfred's obituary. The newspaper described Alfred as a man who'd made money by designing a way to kill a lot of people. Alfred didn't want to be remembered like this, so he established the Nobel Peace Prize. This story shows us why it is good to think about how people will remember us. Okay, so that's the first example. Here's the same story, but told in a different way. In 1888, a man named Alfred had the unusual experience of reading his own obituary in the newspaper. A famed Swedish entrepreneur, the owner of 355 patents, and an inventor who amassed a fortune through the sale of dynamite, Alfred was mistakenly thought dead instead of his brother Ludwig. The obituary characterized Alfred as a merchant of death due to the source of his fortune. Profoundly affected by this perspective of his legacy, Alfred began to reconsider the impact of his life on humanity. He longed to be remembered for more than the source of his fortune. He wanted to become more than a wealthy merchant. Thus, over 4 written pages, he determined to bequeath his estate to 5 people who made the greatest contributions to the betterment of mankind in the upcoming year. More than 100 years later, Alfred Nobel is still remembered, not as the merchant of death, but as the founder of the Nobel Peace Prize. So the differences between those 2 examples are found in the 6 elements of a compelling presentation. So I want to quickly run through those for you. The first is details. They communicate the storyteller's competence, and confidence as well. It establishes your credibility when you're able to give details like the year that Alfred's obituary was printed, how many people and how big the prize money was for the Nobel Peace Prize, things like that. The second element is personal connection. This brings the story close to the listener. The more we know about a person, the easier it is to relate to them. It may be difficult for the average listener to connect with a man who made explosives or established the Nobel Peace Prize. The second example increased personal connection by telling that Alfred had a brother. The third is simplicity. While details that build the main character, event, or message of your story are important, it is also important to select stories that are simple enough to convey. This will hold your audience's attention, and it will force you to pare down information and only communicate the most critical points. Think about a 90-second story for a 10-minute speech. And we'll talk about a little bit later how to incorporate those stories within your content, within your outline, like Mr. Pudawa talked about earlier. The next element of a compelling presentation is plotline development. And you can see this in every book, movie, or TV show that you've ever read or watched. There's an intro, a rising action, a climax, and a resolution. If we use the history of the world as an example, the intro is creation. It sets the scene. The rising action is the original sin of Adam and Eve. It brings in the tension and sets the course of the story. The climax is Jesus' death and resurrection. It's the big event that the whole story points to. And the resolution is his second coming. It ties up the tension and could give more information on what happens after the climax. And this is really, really important in your storytelling. The next element is powerful vocabulary. Think of it this way. If you can only eat 2 cookies, you're obviously going to find the biggest ones on the plate. In the same vein of thinking, by using descriptive words and adjectives, you make each word more valuable. I can say, I went to the store to pick up a few things. Or I could say, my venture to retrieve the ingredients for supper was successful. And the second one actually has less words. The last element of a compelling presentation is an interesting angle. This not only gets you off the train of presenting an order of events, but it also may keep your audience following you. If I had to read all the information in a museum in an internet article, I'd zone out really quickly. But since I'm walking through the museum, making twists and turns, I'm more inclined to read the next plaque because I'm following the museum. This is also a way to build suspense. So the 6 elements of a compelling presentation, here they are once again for you: details, personal connection, simplicity, plotline development, powerful vocabulary, and an interesting angle. If you feel like you've got those down, here's the next little bit of polish that you can do. Keep in mind the necessary extent. Too many unnecessary details, and your audience will be lost in the weeds. Oversimplify, and it may lose some of its impact. Too many $2 words, and the content will be lost in translation. So with each one of those 6 points, you want to be sure to execute, but take it to the necessary extent and not over-exaggerate any one of those. After that, you want to consider application versus impact. And for this point, it can be clearly illustrated by a trip that my family took to Disney World when I was probably 9 or 10. It was me and my older brother, who's 2 years older than me, and my parents, and then one of our friends who had been to Disney a lot. She was kind of our tour guide. And in Animal Kingdom, there is a Finding Nemo live musical puppet show. So in essence, the actors are on stage and they have these really big puppets of the Finding Nemo characters, and the whole thing is a musical. It's probably a 45-minute show. And I'm assuming most of you know the story of Finding Nemo. Nemo wanders off from his dad and in the end is reunited with his father when he finds him in the great big huge ocean. And near the end of the story, Nemo sings a song to his dad, and it ends something like this. Of all the fish in the ocean, I couldn't be more glad that he's my dad. And to my surprise, the lights came up, we all stood up, and there is an elderly woman at the end of our row giving tissues to my crying father. So nobody got up on stage at the end of the show and said, this story is very touching because the father was reunited with his son and the bond they hold. No, nobody stood up and explained the story. They created this world, drew us in, and there was impact. There wasn't application, there was impact. My father was so moved by the story that they had created that he was learning as a father from these puppet fish. And that's what Disney has been doing for years, and we can learn from them. So learn to give your audience some credit. If you have to explain the moral, it won't have as much impact than if you create this world that your audience steps into and is feeling as you're telling it. You don't want to tell the story and then tell the information. You want to try to convey the information through the story. So that's the next big point I want to talk about. So we talked about the building blocks of effective storytelling, and now I want to move into conveying information through compelling stories. Your biggest tool to convey information through compelling stories is a theme. Without a theme, your story reads like a history book. It retells events without purpose or value. With a theme, your story comes to life. The theme drives the coherence of characters, events, and plot. It gives meaning, value, and purpose. Let's go back to the Alfred Nobel example. Think of the theme as legacy. The first example told the events in the order that they happened and said that Alfred learned from this experience and wanted to change his legacy. So it had application, but not as much impact as the second example. The second example emphasized the theme of legacy, talking about how Alfred would be remembered, and he was so moved that people saw him as the merchant of death that he wanted to do something about that. Those kinds of things are relatable for your audience. So using a theme helps your audience feel that impact, and it also helps convey information through your story. The value of storytelling is that stories capture human emotion by inviting the audience to participate in relatable experiences through imagination. If you were on session 2 with Mr. Pudawa, he talked about ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is your credibility as a speaker, logos is logic, and pathos is your emotional impact. So storytelling is going to fill a lot of that emotional impact role. It's going to draw people in. Yes, it fills time, but it also compels your audience to listen intently and to internalize your content. So the role of storytelling in speeches is not just to fill time. A common misconception is the idea that stories and points constitute the same thing in public speaking. Ideally, you have your outline. So you've decided a topic like we talked about with Zach in session 1. You've expounded that out into research and all of the information you want to communicate. You've organized it like we learned about with Mr. Pudawa in session 2. And now you want to insert stories that communicate your message. Your stories should support the logical flow of thought established through your thesis statement. So you will have points, but your stories will be used to communicate the information that you would like to communicate through those points. You can incorporate all kinds of different stories into your speeches. Historical heroes and events. I saw a lot of you are big fans of Corrie ten Boom, Arnold Schwarzenegger, C.S. Lewis. Those are great people to draw from. Also historical events, fictional movies and books like we talked about at the beginning, personal examples like my Finding Nemo story, current events, and even analogies that you've heard, analogies that you come up with on your own that you feel like communicate your point effectively. So with all that in mind, let's write a story. When we finish up today, I would love for you to sit down and work on writing a 90-second story. Incorporate the 6 elements of a compelling presentation. The goal is to memorize it by next week. We'll be using those 90-second stories throughout the intensive. Now, if these sessions have left you wanting more, go ahead and register for the intensive next week, because we're going to be diving into a lot of these topics in more detail, and you'll have an opportunity to work with coaches and peers to practice these tools that we're giving you. So at the end of today, this is the last session. So maybe this evening, sit down for a little bit, or sometime that you have time this week, and try to write a 90-second story. As you practice, you can use a note card to write out words and phrases that jog your memory. Next week during the intensive, we'll use these stories to practice vocal and physical delivery. We'll use these to come up with theme, mantras, and word pictures for those stories and work on building them out. So you'll want to be sure to have that for next week. I do want to give you an example of a story I wrote for this assignment so you can kind of see what to shoot for. So when I was 16, I got my first job working at Wiley's ice cream shop in our small town. One slow afternoon, a woman came in. As I began to engage with her, I learned she had never been in our shop before, but had always driven by and thought it was cute. After a particularly hard day at work, some ice cream sounded good, so she decided to stop in. I gave her a few tastes of our popular flavors, and she looked around the ice cream cases and then said, "You know, a chocolate milkshake sounds really good, but I also really like this Rocky Road type flavor." She paused a while, and then she said, "Do you think there's any way, and maybe you can't, but could you make a milkshake out of the Rocky Road flavor?" I looked at the milkshake machine. I looked at the woman. I looked at the Rocky Road tub. I looked back at the milkshake machine. I looked back at the woman and said, "You know, I think for you, I can make that work." She was so surprised and excited. After a couple minutes, I had whipped up a Rocky Road shake that was to her liking. What she didn't know was we regularly made milkshakes out of any flavor the customer wanted. She walked away with her extra special shake, feeling cared for, like she mattered. And I walked away with an 80% tip and the joy of knowing that I had made her day. So when you're writing your stories this week, keep in mind the 6 elements of a compelling presentation. Be sure to carry them out, but only to the necessary extent. Storytelling is a joy to learn how to do and to execute. Just like Walt Disney, we want to restore order with imagination. We want to instill hope again and again and again. So now I'd like to turn it back over to Mrs. Tofty and Mrs. Rosa for our giveaway.
Paige, thank you so much for sharing. I know this is your heart. I love to hear the stories that you share, and I know you've inspired our listeners. So I'm going to invite Mrs. Natalia Rosa, our Director of Marketing, on screen, and she has an exciting giveaway to hand out.
Yes, good afternoon. I know many of you have stayed with us for this whole day, and we are grateful that you spent the day with us. It's been lots of fun. Great to see you progressing from the first session until now. I know you also have questions about today's giveaway, so I'm going to share our opportunities and announce the lucky winner. So first of all, remember that you can receive free shipping from the curriculum that we've published in partnership with the Institute for Excellence in Writing. We have a curriculum for speech, for value debate, for policy debate. The 6 different principles that Paige just walked you through are actually in the Comprehensive Guide to Speech. So if you're looking for some extra instruction and worksheets and examples, that's a great starting point. And the link is here on the screen, along with the free shipping code. You can also take advantage of our preseason affiliation discount, and that will give you $50 off the regular pricing for the season for your family affiliation. Again, every session we've had lots of questions about NCFCA, competition, how old do you have to be to compete, what does competition look like, how do I get started? We are going to answer all of your questions. It's very difficult to do over chat and in the Q&A box because there are so many of you, but we will be hosting live Q&As just for you on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of this week. Join us at 4 p.m. Central Time, and we'll send an email with more information, but it'll be on the same Zoom link. and it'll be all about NCFCA, answering those questions that you have. Our giveaway for today is from the Forge Leadership Network, and they have graciously provided a full scholarship to their summit event. This is for older students, so we have selected a student that we know is going to be able to take advantage of this opportunity based on the age range. The giveaway comes with that $4.99 value scholarship to the event, as well as all of these neat things that you see displayed on the screen. So congratulations to Sinsen Dries. You are the winner of our giveaway in this session. Sinsen, if you can send me an email at summittech@ncfca.org, I will put you in touch with the people at Forge Leadership Network so you can claim your prize. You can also just chat me directly here inside of Zoom as one of the panelists, and that works as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Paige and Amy Joy, and look forward to hearing all of your great questions that you have been providing in the chat and in the Q&A box so far.
Thanks so much, Natalia. And as Natalia leaves, we're going to invite her awesome husband, Zach Rosa, onto the screen. And he's also going to join our panel to answer your great questions. I just want to commend you. You have asked some really insightful questions in the chat box. So we're going to tackle the ones that we feel like will reach the widest audience and be the most beneficial. If you do continue to have questions, though, we will give you an opportunity to ask those at the NCFCA question and answer time as well. So let's focus in. I'm going to ask both of you to answer this question. Paige, why don't you start us out? How long have you been working on storytelling, and how did you go about improving your skills in that area?
Absolutely. To some extent, I've been working on my storytelling ever since I could talk. In so many scenarios, we come home from school the first day of school in kindergarten and tell our parents all about how they had the sun carpets, the little yellow carpets that everybody grabs one and they sit in a circle on the floor, and you describe the sun carpets and what your teacher said. So to some extent, I've always been working on my storytelling pretty seriously for about 2 years. I really love spoken word poetry and the idea of communicating stories through song and poetry as well as through speeches. I would encourage you to take in all kinds of different stories as you are learning. Mr. Pudawa talked about this last session as well. Is one of the greatest ways that we can learn is by watching others do it well. And we have a great resource with the internet that we can search anything on YouTube and go ahead and find it within reason. I would encourage you to watch TED Talks. A lot of TED Talks are personal stories of people, and they are about 8 to 12 minutes, reasonably what we're shooting for here in NCFCA. So that's a great resource. I would just encourage you to watch stories.
That's great.
Yeah.
Zach, do you have anything to add there?
I just think Paige hit the nail on the head when she said, you start telling stories when you start talking. Trying to explain to your parents why you feel a certain way, why you think a certain way, why you're doing what you're doing. So yeah, just keep practicing. I say what I do is anytime I read a story and I think it's really good, I will write it down and try to break it down into its foundational pieces, what made it a really good story, kind of like the 6 points Paige talked about. And then after I do that, I will rewrite it in my own words.
That's great. How
would I have told this story? That's a really good way to start to practice storytelling and taking really cool information and then putting it into your own speaking style. So read a lot of stories and then tell the stories your way.
That's great. What are some of your favorite stories to tell? So do you like personal stories or historical stories? Zach, how about you? What do you like best?
Sure. I mean, I like all of those stories, historical stories, family stories, personal stories. I'll just give you an example right off the spot. One of my favorite stories to open with when I was giving an impromptu speech, if my impromptu speech was something about perseverance or struggle or something like that, I would always open with a story and then leave the audience hanging halfway through the story or just really into the introduction of the story. And I would close with that story at the very end. So for example, I love talking about the story of the Alamo because it gave me one of the elements that Paige is talking about here, the theme. It gave me the theme of drawing a line in the sand. And that's kind of the theme I carried through my entire speech. So I would open with something along the lines of, in 1836, a line was drawn in the sand and a voice from one side called out, "If you're with me, cross the line." And so then I'll stop there and I'll go through my whole speech and I'll talk about all these examples of perseverance where people crossed the line and accepted the challenge. And then I'll conclude by ending the story of the Alamo. Remember that story, 1836, a line was drawn into the sand and there was a call, cross the line. Well, every single man crossed that line and every single man died fighting for what they believed in. And so then I would conclude it with some cool quotes I would write or something about, something that sounds really cool about standing up for what you believe in. And then I would close it out with that. But that's a really great way to tell a story and then kind of keep that story going throughout the entire speech. And then you can close with the same thing.
Paige, how about you? What are your favorite kind of stories to share?
I find that I'm telling personal stories more than anything. So I mostly have to remind myself that it's not about me and that it is about our audience and about the listener and what might give the most impact for them, which is not necessarily a story about me. If there's one that has more impact and may be better suited for the scenario. Most of the time, I'm not drawing from books or movies. Like I said, you all are way better readers than I am. I'm just awful at reading. So I end up drawing from examples that I encounter on social media or people that I follow, influencers, stories that I've heard in TED Talks. That's usually where I find stories.
That's great. So let's talk about what makes a good story. How do you make a story believable? So one of our listeners is talking a little bit here about personal stories seem to be more believable because you were actually involved in them. How do you take something that's distant from yourself and make that story believable?
Sure. I think a lot of it is in delivery and not necessarily in writing of content. I find that a lot of the personal connection and a lot of the relatability and conversationality that I have building rapport with judges is in delivery and not necessarily in writing content. So eye contact is huge here. You can be a lot more believable when you're making genuine eye contact with your audience. Also in your tone, I feel it can communicate a lot. So be sure that you're selecting stories that you have a personal connection with, that you really relate to, because you'll communicate those a lot more sincerely and authentically than if you are just trying to tell a story to tell a story.
That's great. Any other thoughts on that, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Paige said. It's the same thing when you go to the example of the Alamo. The story, the way they relate to it is when I take that example of crossing the line, I say we all have those lines in our individual lives. We have to step up to a challenge. And how do we do that? So when you're telling a really good story, the more unbelievable it is, if it's a true story, that's even better for you. That's great content to work with because people are always like, wow, this is a really cool story. And then at the end of that, you take that really cool concept that most people don't get to experience in their whole life. And then you apply that concept to them. What are the lines we have to cross?
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about personal stories that have deep emotional connections. So sometimes we have those that are extremely emotional or really impacted us. How do you share that with the audience in kind of that balanced way? So it's not too deep, but not too light. Paige, I know you had one of your speeches that really focused in on an area that you struggled with. So can you just address that for our audience?
Absolutely. My biblical thematic in 2018 season was about fear. And it was a very personal topic to me because I had nightmares every night for a year. And I was still having nightmares in that continuum when I was traveling and going to tournaments. So it was very real and it was very present. It wasn't like this long ago thing that I struggled with that now I've overcome. And so I think I would encourage you to not shy away from vulnerability. Again, you have this opportunity with your judges that they have to listen to you. It's amazing in NCFCA, you get 3 semi-attentive adults that have to listen to you. And so I would encourage you to be vulnerable, be honest, to the extent that you're comfortable, and likely your judges will be comfortable with as well. I have cried in speeches. I have screamed in speeches. So I don't think, obviously there is a point where you do want to be conscious of your audience and know that it may be personal to them as well. So take it with care, but don't shy away from vulnerability.
That's good. Zach, any other thoughts on that?
Not really much to add beyond, don't shy away from being willing to open up to your audience because that's where you relate to your audience. And
I do find that a lot of students do speeches on, or, perform speeches that are about something they're struggling with or have struggled with. And I just want to encourage you. It's a great way for you to find your voice and to find your solutions as you're working through it in your speech. So I love when students pick a deeply emotional topic to them, because it connects with me and it shows me their journey. So speaking of a journey, what do you think of the format of the hero's journey in a speech? Do you all know what that is referring to, where your listener is the hero and you're trying to guide them to a solution? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not familiar with that model. Just based on what you've just said, I think it's a really interesting perspective to take to create a story around the listener. And in some sense, that's what we're doing with all of our stories, because you want the listener to connect with the characters that you do have. But that is a really interesting perspective that would be really cool to build, because it would create the choose your own adventure vibe for your audience, which is cool. I've never thought of it that way.
That's great.
Yeah, there's going to be an entire session on that concept in the intensive. Natalia is going to be teaching on that. So to boil it down for you, you're basically the master Yoda when you're giving a speech. You're the guide and Luke's the hero. Your audience is Luke. You're teaching them what you went through, the stuff you learned, but then you're making the audience the person that goes out and changes the world. That's it boiled down really simply of what making the audience your hero is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about speeches that, again, include stories that you didn't experience. So the question is, do you think it is stronger to ask the judges to imagine that they're in the character's shoes, or just to tell it like it is?
I think both can be impactful depending on how you present them. My biographical narrative in 2018 did a little bit of both. For the most part, I was telling the story of Kim Phuc. If you are familiar, there's a propaganda photo circulating from the Vietnam War of a little girl running through the streets during the Vietnam War. And it's her story of growing up. And she's actually still alive today. But throughout that speech, I was telling her story and giving it in such a way that the audience felt like they were there and they could connect with it. But I paused for probably 2 moments in the speech and then at the end to invite the listener into her shoes. And I told it as though they were the ones experiencing it. So awesome. You can absolutely do a blend. You can do either or, but I think both have opportunity for very strong impact.
That's great. So in light of platform speeches, so a platform speech is a 10-minute original speech that a student writes. It's usually focusing on making some basic point. And then what you're talking about is adding stories to that to kind of support that and to make that message more deliverable and receivable by the audience. So Zach, just tell us a little bit about how many stories to include, how long to make each of those stories. How would you balance that in a platform speech?
Every speech is different for me when I write one. If it's a biographical narrative, it's pretty much one story, the whole speech about one person, and you add little pieces of information from other people's lives, and that's great, but it's primarily one story you're going to tell. In some of my speeches, I'm focusing on, even if it's not a biographical narrative, I'm focusing on drawing out certain elements from one story very heavily, and then I might incorporate a couple other short ones. Or I may just have, 5 really short stories spread out throughout the whole thing that I use more as metaphors or analogies. So it's really up to what your speaking style is. If you're a really good storyteller, which speakers should be, but if you just love telling stories, then incorporate more stories because that's your speaking style. If you're more factual, it may be harder for you to incorporate stories, but you really should. You don't need to have as many, but storytelling is a great way for you to relate to your audience.
That's great. Any other thoughts on that page?
No, I think Zach summed it up really well.
Okay, excellent. So let's just talk about the things that hold storytellers back. What are some aspects that would limit a storyteller, and then give me an example of how you might overcome those? Zach, I'm thinking about what you mentioned even in the first session, right? Like you have those 2 different audiences, those 2 different types of people. So kind of frame it that way for me. The people who don't have any stories, and then the people who have them but don't know how to tell them. How would you encourage them?
So regarding the first group of people, the people who have all those stories and are excited to tell them, their struggle is usually going too long in a story to where it almost loses its the beauty of the story, because now people are just tired of listening to it and you're incorporating facts that aren't really important or don't tie directly into the subject you're speaking about. So that's their struggle. Whereas the struggle of group two is more coming up with the story itself, and they can be really short and more in a more introverted way where there's not enough detail. So it's striking that balance that takes a lot of practice, because I know I can go too long when I tell a story. So I have to work to chainsaw out information from my stories so that they're short enough to still be important. So I don't know if Paige struggled with something different in storytelling, if you went longer or shorter, but Paige, if you want to take from there.
Yeah, typically I end up shorter on all of my content in general. And I have to really work at expanding it, because I am very tagline driven. I'm very like, if I can say it in 4 words that all start with the same letter and rhyme, I'm going to go with that. Versus like 5 paragraphs that might explain it way better.
Yes.
So it definitely is trickier for me to expand out stories. What I find is that it's a lot easier if I try to say it out loud to someone. So if you feel like you're just absolutely stuck and all you're doing is retelling events and saying it's just very dry and you're frustrated, try to tell the story at dinner with your family, or try to tell the story to one of your friends and record it, or have them take notes on the points that you covered. Because most likely if you're telling the story to someone that you know, that you're comfortable with, and you're trying to do it off the cuff, it'll be a lot more natural and you'll end up with a lot more.
That's great.
Quickly to add, I would say your story is told for the impact of it at the end. So when you know what story you're going to tell, write down the impact, then write the story. Because the story should flow into the impact. It shouldn't be just ramble, oh, and then kind of here's something you should consider at the end. That's how you keep your story short enough, but and also short and long enough, depending on how it is. So if I'm telling a story about my grandfather as a war hero, I'm going to mention he was in a war camp for 4 years. I'm not going to talk about his torture. I'm not going to go into detail about what happened to him, because that's not the point. The point I want to get to is when he's out of the war camp, this idea of he went out and started digging a ditch for a road so that kids can go to school. And so I talk about how this is an example of somebody who lost his entire life and yet never gave up trying to make a difference, even if it was down to he could no longer write because it was in their communist regime. He could no longer fight. All the guns were taken from his underground army. And all he was left with was a shovel. And he made the most of that. And for once, that community won. The road was built. So I can spend probably a whole book length worth of information talking about what he went through, but that's not important, because the point is, you know, when the pen runs out of ink and the sword is broken, nobody's going to take your shovel, and you can use that. That's the point I'm trying to get to.
That's really great. And I know we're going to spend all of Monday on the online intensive going through the how of this and actually starting to do this, using that 90-second story, practicing other things to work on building out a full platform speech. So by all means, come back and join us. Last thoughts here, guys. When you think about your speeches that you've given in your time in the NCFCA, what's one of your favorite stories that you remember telling, either in a speech or in an impromptu? Give me an example of a story that you love.
Zach, you can go first.
You want me to go first? I think sure. I've already given a few. So I'd love to give the Alamo example in my impromptus. I would incorporate, I think, my grandfather's story both in my impromptus, and I'm pretty sure I did it in a few platform speeches as well. But another story I love telling is I would tell the story of, if you were in there for my first session, I would tell the story of me shooting my grandmother's plasma screen TV by accident. It's more of a funny, dumb story of me making a big mistake. Yes. And so stories can take on so many different elements and different styles. And so, I would tell that story, and I would incorporate a lot of humor into it. And it was a speech that wasn't necessarily a humor speech at all. Like, it went to a very deep subject. Yep. But stories can contrast your subject, and that's fine, because I was trying to use that story of shooting my grandmother's TV as a story of when you put something that isn't made for the hands of man into the hands of man. And at that point, I was a 12-year-old kid, so the gun wasn't made for me yet. Like, if you put something into my hands like that, I'm going to mess up. And it's the same concept, and we need to base our decision making off some sort of morality, and it needs to be in the right place. So I would use that story to illustrate that point. It's a light story, but it illustrates an important point. And so that's what you use storytelling for, to tell an impact. What is the impact of the story? What do you walk away with?
That's great. Paige, how about you?
Yeah, the other place I thought of that I draw stories from often is from pastors. When I'm listening to a sermon and they use a really great example, just jot it down on your like little bulletin or in your phone or whatever. But this is a story that I heard a pastor tell probably a couple years ago now that I often used in apologetics. So there was this 12-year-old boy that was from a really bad school district downtown Indianapolis. And my church does an outreach program where we tutor for that school. So the high school students from my town and neighboring towns can do after school tutoring with this very, very poor inner city school. And there was this young boy that was receiving tutoring from one of my friends. And he never talked. He never said a word. He would go about his work and a lot of times not complete it. But the high school students would try to talk to him, get him engaged. And he just never said a word. And finally, he was sitting with the pastor one day after school, and they had just set his homework aside. And they were having a really honest moment with this boy. And he said, the little boy finally said, I think if I just had a tea, I would do better. And the pastor said, what do you mean a tea? What does that mean? And the boy repeated himself, I think if I just had a tea, I would do better. And he said, well, what do you mean a T? Is it, you need to know how to write a T or in cursive? I can show, this is a capital T. And he said, no. I think if I just had a T, I would do better. And the little boy had noticed that everyone that was kind to him was wearing a T on a necklace. All he wanted to know was the hope of Christ. Mm-hmm. All he wanted to experience was the kindness that the people with a T had shown him. That's awesome. I think that's what we want to do with stories, is instill the hope of Christ to our audience, to draw them in so that they can experience a kindness like no other, that they can experience the love of our Father God through the stories that we tell, so that they may experience the hope of Christ that maybe they know, maybe they don't know, and maybe they experience that through a funny or dramatic story that you tell in one of your speeches.
That's great. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate you both. We are going to be using all of the things that we learned today in our topics tomorrow. So if you're planning to return, we'll be covering impromptu, apologetics, and extemporaneous speeches. And just to give you a perspective on what those are platform speeches in a hurry. So you are going to learn how to prepare those really quickly. Each one of those different speech categories gives you a certain amount of time to prepare. And then you'll use the same skills that you used today to create, to gather some ideas, to put them in an organized fashion, and then to decorate those ideas with great stories that are engaging to your audience. So I do want to remind you again, we have a very few limited number of spaces left in our online intensive, which runs from August 3rd through the 7th. And so if you are interested in that event, I do encourage you to visit ncfca.org/intensive. Thank you so much for being here today, and we will see you back tomorrow at 11 a.m. Central Time. Have a great night, everyone.